All right. Good morning and good evening. Thanks for tuning into this webinar. I'm sure everyone's joining in from a different time zone. What we realized would be really useful if you could, just go to the chat box at the bottom and type where or which region you're joining in from. It'll be a nice exercise to go through. But thank you for tuning into this webinar, Carbon Offsetting 101, Explore, Assess, Offset, and Retire. I'm Anant. I'm a head of compliance markets at Azzera. And we're actually, frankly, quite excited as this is Azzera's first webinar, and it's part of a larger series, trying to explain the facets of carbon offsetting. It is a complex world which has sometimes in the past received unfair judgment. And we'd really like to use this platform to create awareness about the amount of effort that actually goes into carbon offset projects and their ratings. So before I begin, if you have any questions, use the Q&A box at the bottom, else the chat box for any comments or feedback, and we will try to answer all the questions towards the end of the session. So a large part of the presentation will be done internally by the Azzera team, and starting with Pooja, our CEO and founder of Azzera, then on to Mohammad, who is sustainability manager, and he's actually involved in measuring the emissions and accounting them for larger organizations. Sebastian, who is the head of voluntary carbon markets, and he works really closely with the projects and the ratings, and then myself as head of compliance markets. We also have a panelist who's joining in, Amrita Watsal, who's managing director for business development at EFM Investments and Advisors. So she has a really vast experience creating investment strategies and carbon projects. Thanks for joining us, Amrita. And the webinar is expected to last for about 1 hour, which will be about 20 to 30 minutes of Q&A and about 40 minutes for the presentation itself. So with that, I think I'll hand over to Pooja, and over to you, Pooja.
Okay, well, hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. I see people from Dubai and from Montreal. So welcome. And as Anand said, thank you for joining us. We're very excited. My name is Pooja, and I am the CEO of Azzera. And I'll just jump into it. As we know, the climate change challenge that we have as a society is that we have until 2030 to cut our emissions in half and maintain a 50% chance of avoiding the worst effects of climate change. The vast majority of people hear this, and it doesn't really register. And I think there's 3 factors to that. There's a time element. 2030 is only 7 years away. It feels like the costs are insurmountable. There's a steep mitigation, and we all know that some emissions are unavoidable. And I think the vast majority of people, when they talk about climate change, they think they need to discuss on who's responsible. And we lose time in getting to action. So what we've discovered are these are the 3 sort of main premises of the climate change challenge. And next slide, please, Anand. And fundamentally, every business or individual has unavoidable emissions. And we know this, and I personally have discovered this through the last few years, starting to work in climate change activities as a requirement. So if you go to the next slide, please, Anand. Myself and my co-founder, Nick Hausman, we are both from private aviation. And what does that mean? It's corporate aviation, private jets, the people that are having quite a difficult time in the public space right now. And I've spent over 25 years in that business, building businesses, managing people, managing operations. And in the last few years, we began to start measuring emissions. And it was really a light bulb moment for us to understand the emissions of private jets. which in the grand scheme of things are just a small contributing factor to all of the emissions in the world. But what we realized is, what can we do once we know the emissions? What can we do to reduce those emissions? And we come back to that prevailing assumption or issue that business aviation, like many things, like whether you're an individual or you're a business, has unavoidable emissions. If you fly, you're going to emit. And if you're an individual who operates in this world, who eats food, who takes the train to work, and who does just general things in life, you're going to emit greenhouse gases in your everyday life. So these unavoidable emissions became an issue for us. How do we attack that? How do we address that? If we need to address the challenge, the climate change challenge, all emissions have to be considered. Next slide, please, Anand. So we set up Azzera to address this unavoidable emissions issue. And in the current society and current context, we realized that there's some components in doing that. Once you measure the emissions, if I come back to the example of private aviation, once you measure the emissions, a proper sustainability strategy should be evaluating those emissions and looking at how to reduce them. So in this example, let's say an aircraft emits 16 tons, or a thing or a company or a person in their lifestyle emits 16 tons, then if they do certain changes, they can maybe reduce by a certain amount, let's say to 14 tons per year. The rest needs to be addressed. Those are unavoidable emissions. And what we suggest and what we are saying, and the topic of today's conversation, is about getting to net zero through offsetting. And offsetting is the funding of climate positive projects. So without the reductions, you can call it carbon neutral. So if you were to measure 16 tons and offset 16 tons, that would be called carbon neutral. But really what we want is net zero, which means a comprehensive strategy, including offsetting. And today, the best way to get to net zero and address those unavoidable emissions is to look at offsetting. Next slide, please. So as I said in the previous slide, the goal for Azzera, and in general for many companies like Azzera, is to provide a complete solution to allow for individuals and businesses to have a comprehensive, sustainable, and an impactful sustainability strategy. The first step is to measure your carbon footprint. The second step is to define a strategy to reduce and compensate. The third is to fund high impact climate projects, positive projects. And then finally, the fourth is to retire credits and get certified. And what does that mean? You actually receive certificates once those credits that you fund, that you buy, are taken out of the system and retired. And those certificates can be used against your claim of being being net zero. One of the things that's not addressed in our slides that I just want to touch on is the concept of greenwashing. And again, getting to net zero is important. It's an important distinction. You have to think about your whole plan. How will you reduce your emissions once you know your emissions? If you, as a company in particular, measure your emissions and you know there are avoidable emissions, but you then offset anyways, that can be considered greenwashing. If you actually take the steps to reduce those emissions that can be avoided, and then you offset with high quality offsets, that's the distinction between not greenwashing and greenwashing. So we'll repeat that again later on in the presentation, but I just want to make sure that people understand. Greenwashing is basically not making an effort to take the necessary reductions in your sustainability strategy and just buy offsets to make a carbon neutral solution. Next slide, please. So why Azzera? You know, I obviously, I'm here as the CEO of Azzera, and we've assembled this fantastic team. And one of the things we wanted to do when building this company was to make sure that we really made a difference, not just for business aviation, but for any individual or business that worked with Azzera. So our goal is to provide complete transparency throughout the process, from the time that we access carbon offset markets through to getting to the client and the client acquiring and retiring those certificates. There's various factors. I won't go through all of them, but these are basically the fundamental premises of Azzera: clarity, customized solutions, and demonstrated action. All of our team is focused on providing those three things to our clients to make sure that they have the best solution for them. And I think the most interesting part of all of this is actually the offset projects, and we'll get to that in shortly with Sebastian. I think this is the key. You know, we want to make sure that the client feels comfortable and that Azzera is making a difference and accelerating and having a sustainability strategy and effortless experience. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, this is part of our team. This is the team in Zurich. Starting with the left, it's Rani, and then Andy. Rani is head of sales. Andy is head of industry relationships and communication and marketing. Sebastian, you will hear from in a couple of minutes, a few minutes after Mohammed, who's not in this picture, myself, and then Anant. And our vision is that we believe in a society that is naturally net zero. So we've learned what net zero is, and we really believe that eventually society needs to, in order for us to beat this climate challenge, we need that society lives in a world that is naturally net zero, meaning everyone is thinking about a sustainability strategy for themselves, for their companies. Everyone is either reducing their emissions and offsetting their unavoidable emissions and funding projects that are going to make the difference, so that our requirement to offset will become less and less over time. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our special guest. We have Amrita Vatsal, who is the Managing Director of Business Development for EFM. And EFM is a company that develops real asset investment opportunities, land management, and financial investment advisory for markets primarily related to forest land conservation. And we're very pleased to have her. I'll turn it over to her so she can expand a little bit further. Amrita.
Hello and good morning. Thank you for that introduction, Pooja, and it's so nice to meet you and most of your team today. So thank you for the opportunity again. My name is Amrita Vatsal. I'm a managing director at EFM. And for a little context on who we are an investor in nature-based climate solutions. Since early 2004, we've been investing in forest land, primarily in the US. We're headquartered here in Portland, Oregon. We manage about 250 million in assets under management and about 130,000 acres across the Western US, primarily in a strategy that focuses on the transition of forests from an industrial forest land management regime to a climate smart strategy that we think is the future of forestry. In addition to our forestry strategies, EFM serves as an advisor to investors, corporations, and family offices who are all navigating their net zero challenges and wanting to create financially focused investment portfolios that can address the opportunities and risks that this transition to net zero presents. So I'm thrilled to be able to talk to you a little bit today. The perspective that I will bring is really as an investor in this space, And I apologize in advance. I will have to leave our conversation by 8:30. So if there are any questions, please feel free to address them in the chat and I will do my best to respond. With that, I think, Anant, you asked me to share a little bit about my observations as an investor in this landscape and sort of thinking about what an investor is looking at in nature-based climate solutions and particularly in forest carbon projects. I think a couple of observations first. Number one, we have really seen in the last 2.5 years a really significant change in the forest land and in the carbon market sector. The demand for carbon offsets has really almost doubled. The market for voluntary carbon offsets, as you all might know, has broached over $1 billion. And this demand is really increased primarily because of corporate commitments to net zero, but also asset managers, financial investors, but finally, and most importantly, also the commitments of governments, all who are embarking on this very ambitious transition to a fossil fuel free economy. That demand has really, in our experience and observation, led to significant consolidations and investments in the carbon market space. It was a very sleepy sector for the last few decades, and we're finally seeing a lot of entrance of new actors, private equity investors, which is very unusual for the space that has previously been dominated by DFIs and the World Bank and more foundation philanthropic investors. We're seeing financially motivated investments coming into nature-based projects. There's a recognition that there's a real undersupply of projects and there's a lack of investment in this space. Traditionally, financial investors have really been focused on putting capital into fossil fuel mitigation and renewable energy projects. And we are now recognizing that the nature-based climate solutions sector has really been left behind and needs to quickly catch up. So that has led to a lot of vertical integration. We are seeing now project developers getting more into land acquisition. We're seeing brokers and aggregators moving into the consulting businesses. And there's just a lot of movement in this space, which is great. We're sort of welcoming this influx of capital and interest in the sector. The traditional, how the carbon markets and carbon projects have really changed forest land investing is also really remarkable. In just a span of 5 to 8 years, we have seen how traditional forest land investments have undergone a quick change in their underwriting process. And now it's, before being able to evaluate carbon opportunities was really unusual. And now it is sort of pretty much par for the course to be able to underwrite the value of carbon inherent in a land asset like forest land. And that's bringing different kinds of investors to the table, but it is also creating an opportunity for traditional investors, pension funds, that have been traditional forestry investors to take a look at their portfolios and really evaluate how their forest land portfolios can be managed differently in order to meet their net zero targets. So those are some of the observations we've had in terms of investment in the space. We think that investors will really, what this market needs is long-term permanent capital capable of withstanding the ups and downs of carbon markets. And we think that that is also incredibly important for the creation of high quality carbon projects that are able to deliver benefits to communities for 20 to 40 to 100 years and do so in ways that can be stable and continue to provide value to investors and society for the long term. So I'll stop there and see if there are any specific questions for me at this point, but otherwise I will thank everybody for your time today and to Azzera for the opportunity to share our perspective. Thank you.
Thanks. We thought that was really helpful. And yeah, really unfortunate that we can't have you for the Q&A, but really thanks for participating and taking time out for this. I think if there are questions in the Q&A, maybe you could just try answering them while the other speakers, continue.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah, I think with this, let's move into the first step of the process of getting to net zero, which is measuring what emissions you have. And with that, I think I'll hand over to Mohammed, who's going to take us through this.
Thank you, Anand. Hello again, everyone. I'm Mohammed Salim, the Sustainability Manager at Azzera, and I will be briefly talking about carbon accounting and its importance for carbon offsetting. I would like to start with this quote here. You can't manage what you don't measure, and so you won't be able to basically offset or compensate your emissions until you quantify or measure your GHG footprint. And this is where the importance of carbon accounting comes. And carbon accounting, also known as GHG accounting or carbon footprint measurement, is the process by which organizations quantify their emissions within a defined organizational and operational boundaries. This process consists of 5 steps. The first being selecting the GHG accounting standard. And the most widely used standard is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol standard, which is a framework for business and other entities to measure and report their greenhouse gas emissions in ways that support their missions and goals. The second step is the defining of the boundaries, and we have the organizational and operational boundaries. And an organizational boundary refers to the approach in which you decide which assets to be included in your analysis. And we have 2 basic approaches. The first being the equity share, which accounts for GHG emissions from operations according to its share of equity in the operation. The second being the control approach, which accounts for GHG emissions from assets which you have either operational or financial control. An operational boundary defines the scope of direct and indirect emissions for operations that fall within the organizational boundary. And I'm going to be speaking a bit in more detail in the next slide. The third step, which is the data collection step, is considered by most to be the most challenging and time-consuming step for organizations, as it involves a lot of communication between different departments and different suppliers, and initially it's not as easy to be able to know exactly what you need to collect and how to collect it, and there is usually sometimes in a lot of the cases some data caps where you can't collect. So this, I would say, is considered by the organizations to be the most challenging. The fourth step is the calculation of the emissions, which is based on the collected GHG activity data, as well as GHG emission factors. And finally, all the results are reported and analyzed in what's called a GHG inventory report. Next slide, please. Okay, so I want to talk a bit more about the scopes of the emissions, which is related to the operational boundary that I just spoke about. And according to the standard, the GHG emissions are grouped in 3 different scopes. We have scope 1 emissions, which are the direct emissions from operations that are owned or controlled by your company. And examples of scope 1 emissions include emissions from fuel sources such as natural gas or diesel that are used in company facilities. Also emissions from refrigerants used in the facilities, or emissions from company vehicles or fleets. Scope 2 emissions are the indirect emissions from the generation of purchased or acquired electricity, steam, heating, or cooling. And finally, we have the scope 3 emissions, which are all the indirect emissions other than those included in scope 2 that occur in the value chain. And the value chain here refers to the full life cycle of a product or process, including material sourcing, production, consumption, disposal, and recycling. So under scope 3, there are 15 different categories. And I'm going to mention the most widely reported by companies, which is usually business travel, employee commuting, purchase goods and services, and waste. And I would like to mention that typically Scope 3 emissions represent most of the emissions, accounting for from 65 to 95% of the emissions, and they are the hardest to abate. Lastly, there are 6 different GHGs, which are 6 different greenhouse gases that are accounted for, which are the carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, hydrofluorocarbons, perchlorofluorides, which are found in refrigerants, and finally SF6, which is used in large electrical equipment. And that concludes my my explanation of the carbon accounting. And now I'm gonna hand it over to Sebastian to continue.
Thanks, Mohammed, for discussing the first step, which is carbon accounting. And I'm going to speak about what carbon offset projects are and from which project they actually come from, and try to explain how with Azzera we differentiate them with several criteria to help you navigate the market. So I believe, wait, you can switch slide and go to the first one. Sorry, my computer is okay. So first thing I have to state is to explain what is carbon offset is to introduce that logic that greenhouse gas emissions, they mix globally in the atmosphere. So it doesn't really matter where exactly they are produced or removed. The effect on climate change is going to be the same. For the atmosphere, if you cease emission somewhere or you enable emission reduction somewhere else, it has the same impact. So carbon offsets are actually making the second option, enabling emission reduction somewhere else, possible and cost effective. The carbon offset is going to refer to reduction in carbon equivalent emissions. So Mohammed just talked about the different GHG, greenhouse gases, and we actually normalize this with the effect each one has, and we talk about carbon equivalents in general. So we normalize by the effect of the CO2. And we're going to talk about increases in carbon storage that are going to be used to compensate emissions that occur somewhere else. And they're transferable, those carbon offsets, and therefore they can be used to exchange with climate benefits between either individuals or companies. They're certified by governments or independent certification bodies, and they represent an emission reduction of 1 metric ton of carbon equivalent, CO2 equivalent. When you buy a carbon credit or carbon offset as either individual or company, you can retire it, as Pooja said, to claim the underlying reduction for your own reduction goals. And then it's off the market. Next slide, please. I think if you know about carbon offset a bit, you heard about the distinction between carbon offsets that are avoidance credits or removal credits. Avoiding carbon being released into the atmosphere or actively removing carbon out of the atmosphere. At Azzera, our logic is that we strongly believe that both mechanisms are needed. I'll go a bit deeper into this, but another way also to distinguish those carbon offsets, it comes from classifying them from either nature-based solutions or technology-based solutions. That's what you see on the side. The most efficient way, if I take the first one, which is nature and removal, the most efficient way to remove carbon from the atmosphere is still photosynthesis. So the plant is going to, with photosynthesis, sequester carbon out of the atmosphere and store it into biomass. They mostly need water, sun, and atmospheric carbon, which is really cost effective. So planting trees, for example, when they grow, it's going to be a nature-based solution that increases the carbon stored into the frost. So it's a carbon removal credit. Then, depending on the type of tree, it's going to take a few years to a few decades for it to be mature enough to store a significant amount of carbon. So we have to wait a bit. And also, what happens if it get cut down? It can be used to heat the house or something. So I think we all know what's happening with the Amazon and deforestation in the Amazon, and that's why protecting the carbon stocks that already exist, trees, in that case forests, is as important as planting new ones. So some projects are therefore going to be based on preventing deforestation. So we're going to estimate how much carbon can be avoided being released by protecting the trees, compared to potential baseline of cutting them and using them for, normal ways they're used in different countries. And those are actually avoidance credits. Now, this is nature-based. For a good example of technology-based avoidance are projects accelerating the transition to renewable energy. In a fossil fuel dominated power grid, for example, depending on the country, you're going to implement a new wind farm that's avoiding the need to draw energy from coal power plants, and therefore avoids the associated emissions. And finally, the fourth part there are a lot of people developing more and more efficient ways to capture carbon from the atmosphere directly via technology, building new materials and new methodology that are storing it, capturing it and storing it somewhere. And you understand there that the logic of storage is quite important to look at. So next slide, those are the different type of carbon credits I want to talk about. But then we also have to understand where do they come from. So it's a cycle from an idea to a retirement. So there are a whole lot of people working to develop projects, certify them, issue and sell credits. And I think we had a good example with our panelists coming and explaining how money is actually invested in those carbon projects. First, the project proponent is going to work in close collaboration with the developer, is going to put in place a project that would effectively issue carbon credits. Everything is going to be based on the methodology defined by an official independent registry, such as Azzera, for example, which is the biggest one you probably heard of. And then the project is reviewed by a third-party validator and given a green light to go forward to be implemented. So at that point, projects have to prove that the money they would receive from the carbon credits at the end is what make them viable. And we're going to discuss this. It's called additionality. We have to show that projects being funded are being funded because they project future revenues to come from the sale of carbon credits. After the implementation, carbon credits are issued on a yearly basis. And it's after the verification that the climate benefit has happened. So therefore, there's no future action. It has happened. And Azzera in the middle is identifying those projects, sourcing them as close as possible to the developer, and using them to retire measured emissions from either companies or individuals. Next slide. So with the number of different project standards and methodology, the market is quite difficult to navigate. There's a great need to compare projects in order to support the most impactful ones. And we will start with next one. At Azzera, we define the logic which is called the triple layer due diligence. So first, we apply the International Carbon Reduction and Offset Alliance standards, which are defining quality principles to measure, reduce, and offset emissions. They also provide guidance to which standards high quality credits should be sourced from. So that's the second step. We actually source credits from those standards. We have examples here, Azzera, Gold Standard, American Carbon Registry, Climate Action Reserve, and there are a lot of others. And they issue credits that are verified to be real, measurable, permanent, independently verified, additional, and unique. And those independent non-profits, they provide guidelines, tools, methodology that are going to certify, issue, and continuously validate those carbon offsets from each project. They ensure that a strong and a solid foundation to the voluntary market, which is really, really important. So we only source credits from there. And those registries are also an extremely good way to ensure rules of traceability and accountability have been followed. They allow us to track issuance to retirement and the ownership of the credits until the retirement where a company or an individual claims the climate benefit. And also they provide publicly available documentation, certifications, validation, and credit issuance documents that our team is going to review during project assessments. And it's really, it's a key to the due diligence everyone should actually do. And finally, it leaves a large and elaborate pool of projects, even if you source from a small amount of registry. It's still a large amount of projects. On top of that, at Azzera, we add our own rating system, our method to differentiate the project by climate impact, environmental, social, and development benefits. So we call it the Azzera Impact Score. It's a score, it's a 5-point system resulting from a weighted sum of 4 criteria. Our goal is easy differentiation between project and credible funding. So for each project, we spend a lot of time understanding the official documentation, reviewing, rating key features, and getting back also to project developer to know what happened, what they did, why they did it. And we also try to leverage our own rating database to compare with previous ratings of similar types of credits, type of projects. Finally, our rating is also always the result of 2 different assessors. It takes a bit more time, but it's much more precise. So we have 4 criteria. First, we evaluate the mechanism by which emissions are either avoided or removed from the atmosphere. We evaluate the assurance that those credits are effectively representing a real ton of CO2 and do not over or even underestimate their value. We're going to look for data, clues of precise measurements to validate that baselines that I talked about for avoidance project are effectively estimated. And for removal, we actually look for clues for precise measurements, calibration, validation systems. That's our first thing. Second one, we want to ensure that carbon credit finance is doing something more than just business as usual. So this is what we called before additionality. Now we don't really have time. We really must fund projects that are truly doing something more for climate change mitigation that would not have occurred without the funding from the carbon offsets. So it's not really a yes or no question, but a scale. And we break this down to 2 types. We're going to have regulatory additionality and financial additionality. We're going to consider government fundings, low regulations in the area in the previous years, and the potential available predictions for the upcoming years to define if the implementation of a project is additional at that time. For financial additionality, we're going to consider whether the project would have been economically viable without the financial gain from the issued carbon offsets. It's difficult, that's why it's a scale. Difficult to be precise, but we still need to have information of how much it's additional or not. It's a way to compare them. The third thing is we try to answer the question, for how long are those emissions staying out of the atmosphere? I talked to you about removal projects that are capturing CO2 out of the atmosphere. The question is then, where do they store it? Infinite storage is, or infinite avoidance has a time limit. It's impossible, which it does not exist. No project can comfortably claim that the carbon will be stored forever. But still, we need a goal. We need information. So we score actually project based on signed contract, land ownership, electricity provider contracts, something that's going to say, okay, this is still going to be viable for that much amount of time, which means that it lowers the risk of reversal of the climate action of the project. We're going to look also at natural hazard risks, contract stating project permanence, and risk of leakage. What we call leakage is emission being displaced to other place in time or space. Imagine now I'm providing more efficient cookstove for people to stop cutting trees or to cut less trees for eating their food, preparing their food. something that can happen is that actually when they see that they have more efficient cook stove, it means that they can actually cook more and they buy two. So they use the same amount of wood. So those things, you still need to have a look for them. You still need to discuss with project developer. You still need to compare to what happened before to see if the climate action is actually not reversed. And finally, our fourth criteria is we define whether or not the project have impact that go beyond climate action. Have the project implemented any complementary measure or action that's going to benefit the world out of the climate action? You're building a wind farm, but then are you also funding a hospital? Are you also funding evening lessons for kids to actually learn mathematics? Are you actually also changing the whole pipeline system to provide clean electricity when you're building a hydropower dam? Those things are actually really important. And as others, we work by defining first co-benefits in line with the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. They've set a set of 17. And every goals is going to be first described through a set of quantifiable indicators that we list, and then we assess whether the project actions improve them or not. Whenever we lack essential data, it's like anyone, we always get back to project developers, try to get the more information we can, look for more information, and then we rate lower if we don't have any answer. Our team spend a lot of time refining this criteria and validating the Azzera impact score, and it's always available when we propose the projects for transparency. It's really important, and projects that score low are usually not even considered in our portfolio. Thank you. You can go to the next one. I think it's your turn. Sorry.
Thanks, Sebastian. That was really interesting, and I think there are some questions that I can, bring out in the Q&A. But yeah, just to sum it up, what we've discussed in this session, I think we've seen this voluntary carbon market, really grow in the last 2 years from being, the new kid on the block to being the prime attraction for investments from asset managers, financial institutions, and even industry. So in 2021, we saw about over $1 billion of credits that were traded, which was a threefold rise for what we saw in 2020, which was the start of COVID. And the demand of these credits is really large, which is really about 50% of the existing supply. And what we see is that this demand is slightly moving towards higher quality credits. And it's now, the topic of high quality is now the most prevalent within organizations that are also stakeholders in the offsetting ecosystem. So their focus is this, provide quality and credibility for all of these credits and make sure that, there's no slippage in the measurements and the methodologies. So what we found is that, while they still have, guidelines and, best practices on what should be done, there's really no straightforward guide on, what's good, what's bad. And this is really where the ratings come in handy. So going back to that, the surplus that's there in the voluntary market at the moment, we find that there's some of it that's, finding its way into other schemes. For example, we call these schemes, compliance markets. And these are really regional markets where there's a national or a subnational governing authority that sets their own mandatory standards. So the project must follow those guidelines for measurements and qualification. And that's really decided by the governing authority. So what that does for the project is brings it additional credibility, going beyond voluntary and becoming more of a compliance requirement for that market. One such example is the CORSIA program, or the Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation. And this scheme is really going to cover about 77% of aviation industry and commercial also. But basically, CORSIA requires projects to meet additional guidelines in terms of, for example, the first crediting period for the project must be starting in 2016. And they also have other requirements, for example, for REDD+ projects or REDD+ countries. But once those projects are past that CORSIA standard, it means that they become at par in terms of the perceived quality by the people who are buying them or purchasing them. In this case, it's really aviation. So yes, that means the credit attracts a premium in price, but perhaps I think this will be a situation that happens in the early years of the CORSIA program when there is slightly lesser supply of these credits. Or there's the other example of California, Quebec, the emission trading system, which is linked between those two jurisdictions. There's the Air Resources Board, which defines the methodology for the projects. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are several of such schemes, and essentially the kind of credits that they generate is what the industry likes to call compliance offsets. So to put it all together, all of this surging demand from within the VCM, as well as these additional schemes, is going to make sure that there are more and more projects that get listed. And so far, we've seen some estimates. I mean, most conservative of them saying, $10 billion is the size of the market by 2030, and we've even seen estimates of $50 billion. But I mean, it's again too soon to say it. It's an evolving market. There's this year even conversations around the additional accountability for these credits. So the coming COP, which is in November in Egypt this year, is going to address the conversation around double counting. So there will be more specifics on subnational and national accounting measures. So how do you count offsets that have been retired in one region and by chance export to another region and consume there? So I think with this, we'll come to the end of the presentation and we can move into the Q&A. I'm going to wait for a few minutes to see, to have a look through the questions.
We do have already interesting questions. Right?
Yeah, definitely. So let's go through those first, and we can come back to these. So really quickly on Sebastian, this one is for you. So what do you think about the comparison of soil carbon versus ocean carbon? I want to understand more about which one of these absorbs or sequesters more, and is it possible but has a greater potential in the future?
Yeah, so I think it's two different things, right? When you speak about the ocean, it's mostly CO2 being diluted into the ocean. So most part of the CO2 is passive. I mean, it depends a lot of the temperature of the water. So we don't really it's difficult to act on it. So when we speak about using the ocean to capture CO2, it was mostly going to say, but people talk about mostly algae, for example, growing algae in the ocean. So it's not really scalable for now, but it's also really great potential. But then for soils, in general, it's storing as a storage is much less than the ocean, but still it's the highest storage of carbon, I think, on land. And what happens is a lot of new methodologies are actually popping out to try to issue credits from regenerating the carbon of the soil, because actually agriculture today has a lot of negative impact of the amount of carbon you're going to store. And yeah, so for now, there are like a few issuance or on general registries, but then it's a really good way to act on two things at the same time. I mean, farmers really have a lot of trouble and have a lot of ecological footprint. So it's a way issuing carbon credits from them changing their practices to involve more, biological life in the soil, using less pesticides, changing in their tilling habits and those things. So I think it has much more potential, I would say, as Sebastian now. I think the soil has much more potential because you can act like pretty fast on it. And using regen agriculture practices is going to lower, in general, your yield, which means that the carbon credit revenue actually are going to add on top of this and going to make it additional, I guess.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I think what struck me the most is soil. I was always under the impression it's more of seaweed related, ocean capture.
Yeah, than just saying we're going to store carbon in the ocean. It's just it's just not there's no idea for now about this. The storage is really mostly diluted in the ocean, but then it's like trees, storing biomass from algae and also in minerals in general. So it means the corals are actually to grow and build actually coral reefs that are actually CO2, right? So enhancing this, I mean, there are a lot of projects for this, but not on official registries, I would say. So it's just the infancy of those ideas.
So I see there are some questions that have popped up. There's one from Karan. With the expansion of carbon markets, many registries are popping up for issuing carbon credits. What role does such institutions play in the long run on the credibility of the voluntary market?
Is it for me or for you?
Well, I think it's best if you take this one. Yeah.
I mean, if you speak about this to already existing registry, they would say that they worked a lot for this. There are a lot of methodologies. Obviously, there's been scandals of bad projects, sure. But then if you look at it as a whole, scandals are really low amounts, and they worked a lot to have really standards, methodology that can be used by anyone. Adding more registries on top of this is kind of difficult because they've built standards, so you have to rebuild everything. But still, it's all those methodologies we just talked about, oceans, growing algae, for example. Those methodologies actually, they're not certified by the registry right now. So if you want to go fast to scale them, we have to build the infrastructure that's going to use them. And it can be pretty quicker by building a registry at the same time. We have Nori, for example, it's a project we sourced from. They build their own registry for regenerative agriculture credits, and they use blockchain for transparency to be faster also. Instead of rebuilding a whole infrastructure, you use blockchain for this. So, I mean, for me, it brings credibility, but then you still have to do your own due diligence and be sure that you're actually coping with the standards.
Yeah, I agree. And let's not forget that these registries, entered this ecosystem from the start. They were here from the age of CDM. It took them 10 to 15 years to set up and establish themselves. So adding more registries is going to dilute that credibility. Yeah.
Can I just add one thing, Anant?
Yes, please go ahead, Pooja.
Yeah, sure. I agree with everything Sebastian said. It's a balance between wanting to scale quickly because we need to. We have the time issue, right?
Yeah.
And doing your due diligence, because the ideal is that we have one super registry. That would be the ideal for everyone. One set of regulations, that one standard, so that there's a little bit of a comfort level that it's the same standard across the board. A carbon credit generated by a certain methodology from project X is the same as project Y. If it's the same methodology and the same standard, same registry. But at the end of the day, we don't want to inhibit progress, which is what we need right now. And I think the key here is what we are trying to accomplish here at Azzera, is to do the due diligence, is to make sure that the methodology is sound, make sure that the project that is certifying is actually meeting the methodology standards, in addition to what the auditor has done, doing our homework. So it's really important, this step.
Thanks for adding that, Pooja. I can go to the next question, which is around, don't many solar or solar-based solutions require vast mining for resources, and stopping deforestation is not attainable? Which removal technique would be more successful? I think it's a comparison of engineered solutions versus nature-based solutions.
Yeah.
So what do you think would be more successful?
It's also a matter of costs, I think, a lot. For the mining part, I mean, yeah, sure. It has impact. It has to be stated, but then it gives us also an opportunity to try to start doing mining in a better way. I'm not going to say It's environmental friendly to mine, sure, but then we still use electricity, right? And we need a way to produce it, and the cleanest possible. So at the end, even if you take into account all the effects of the bad effect of mining, it's still better for the environment. Solar panels are still better. And then I don't have, I mean, we can go back to you, anonymous person, with numbers, but I strongly believe that it's way better, and it gives us also an opportunity about this. If you listening to TED Talks, sometimes there's one that came out last week, I think, about mining and how it needs to scale in a different way than before if we want to cope with renewable energy crisis. And for the removal part, which one is more successful? I would say, I mean, I'm on the tree side. I think we discussed this with Anant before also. Anant also is on the tree side. But then, yes, technologies exist that are removing this carbon out of the atmosphere. The good part is with trees, actually, they store it in wood. So if you're saying you cannot stop deforestation, I'm not sure about this. Trying to stop it is still something. And even if you avoid 50% of it, it's still something and still winning. So I would say you need to invest in both.
Thanks. And there are some smart ideas coming out in removal technology, especially within mining. I read about mineralization. So they would capture carbon within the abandoned mine and the soil that's around it. So there are definitely some interesting solutions there. I want to step into a question around measurement. So this one is for you, Mohammed. You mentioned that most companies, 65% of their CO2 footprint is within scope 3. Is this the same for all companies? And that's a general question, open question.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. Typically, most of the companies do have their scope 3 emissions being the most out of or contribute the most in terms of the emissions. However, just a good example, because Pooja was just mentioning, within the aviation industry, for example, that's not the case, because, for example, operators, they're going to have most of their emissions within scope 1 as the operating the jet. There is a vast amount of emissions that actually that are due to the burning of fuel from operating the jets. And in the case of operators, this is considered to be in scope 1. So in that case, for sure, scope 3 won't be or won't account for the majority of their emissions. However, I'm talking specifically for manufacturers or suppliers or companies which that basically have a lot of different supply chain or value chain within their organization. In these cases, scope 3 tend to be a lot more than scope 1 and 2. So I think I really like that this question came. Maybe I didn't specifically mention, but yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Isn't it a matter also of what you can act on? Scope 3 is really difficult to act on, right?
Well, scope 3 are much harder to abate, but in terms of reporting, it's a different case because, you know, in all cases, you need to report all the emissions that you can get data for, or that you know that exist within your organization. However, the next step would be which ones you can actually act upon and try to reduce. And for sure, scope 3 typically are the hard.
I'm sorry, I didn't say it properly. Yeah. Acting on also like getting the data from all your supply chain might be also I guess.
Yes, because in a lot of these cases you actually need the communication and the interaction with people outside your organization, and that's the case with scope 3. For scope 1 and 2, typically you have a bit more control as to getting the data or collecting the data. So yeah, especially if, as I said, there's a lot of supply chain involved. In that case, you need to do a lot of contacting and a lot of communication in order to be able to get these data.
Yeah, definitely, it's a complex question.
Yeah.
All All right, so I'll come to a question mostly for Pooja, just to get Pooja, if you could give us an understanding of where the offset market is heading, and also how have you seen change in conversation within the industry, and what's there, how are they moving towards offsets, and how has it changed in your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Anant. I mean, general, you mentioned earlier, the offset market, the predictions are all over the map. I've even seen Forbes issued recently an estimate that by 2028, the voluntary market would be worth $2.7 trillion. And so I think it's very difficult to say where it's going. There's a lot of negativity, again, around greenwashing and this concept. Generally speaking, an awareness has been building, and that's because of many factors, primarily just the weather. People are talking about climate change now. So people are starting to ask the questions. And so more and more companies are feeling the momentum and the pressure with the SEC requirements that's spreading from country to country. So more and more companies are starting to question, what should we do? So that's the first step, right? To get from awareness to action, it's a whole other story. And what our goal is with Azzera is to make it effortless to go from awareness to action, because we want to make sure there's a reassurance and a peace of mind that you're taking the right steps in understanding your emissions, the breakdown of your emissions, things that, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, what can be avoided and what is unavoidable, and then doing the necessary due diligence and offsetting the rest. Everyone can become net zero. We just have to do the work. That being said, in terms of the market, we still have quite a long way to go. But I think that if all of these predictions, regardless of the prediction, there's only one direction. It's going up, which means more and more people are going to invest in offsets. The challenge will be to find quality supply and find quality supply fast enough. Because if we go back to what Sebastian has taught us today, is that a carbon offset is a verified credit. It's an event that's already occurred. And many of these projects and technologies take years to develop and certify. So we have to act. It is the challenge of the time. And we all have to look within ourselves to do what we can as individuals and businesses.
Thanks, Pooja. I think that was a good ending to the session that we have here. So just to make you guys aware, this is just for the first one of the series that we're doing. We'll be doing a lot more of these sessions around diving deeper into the world of carbon offsetting, and going into addressing separate questions like additionality, removal, avoidance. These terms will keep coming up more and more. So stay tuned to our LinkedIn feed, and also if you've worked with us before, reach out to us and we'll give you more information on the next one. But thanks everyone for joining in, and thanks to the Azzera team to preparing this together. Have a nice day, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.